Hello and welcome to the China Unraveled podcast, your unfiltered source for what's going on inside China and what it means for the world. I'm your host, Jason Scheftel, and I also used to believe the China story we've all been told. But after living, studying, and traveling throughout the country, I now know better. China's past, present, and future are not what they've been made out to be. Over the last year, I've turned what I've learned into a book, while on here, I shed some light on the big issues. Today's episode is about how to gauge China's strength and how not to. Opinions on the most basic questions about China can be extreme and often totally opposed. Talking heads say China is about to rule the world and that it is about to collapse. That China's military is the scariest thing since the Soviet Red Army and that it is actually made of tissues and styrofoam. We hear both that China's economy is destined to be the largest in the world and that it is about to fall painfully back down to earth. At the root of all of this confusion are some very poorly answered questions about China's true potential. A combination of rampant consumer marketing, biased news, and straight propaganda has led a lot of people astray. So let's try to untangle this messy situation. Before all sorts of economic numbers, statistics, or indicators of technical progress come up, people evaluate countries based on a sort of primitive equation. It goes like this: population size plus territorial size equals overall national power. This sort of thinking lurks behind even the most sophisticated analysis. It's almost like an instinct or a gut reaction humans have, like a variation of sizing someone up on the schoolyard. And it's pretty common. Back in 1942, the average person in the US would have weighed the overall strength of the United States and Imperial Japan using something like this. But we're now in the 21st century, and we've learned a lot about what empowers countries and what does not. It is time to ditch this equation. Some version of this equation almost certainly exists in your mind, so I'm going to spend some of this episode trying to break it down. China is big on both counts. But is this a good thing or a bad thing? If you ignore the United States, a massive population or an enormous territory is almost always a bad thing. Countries become durable and powerful when they are the right size. So let's start with population. China is the most populous country on Earth. Many people fear it will produce an inexhaustible tide of PhDs, engineers, geniuses, soldiers, entrepreneurs, and all other sorts of workers. But labor economics is a lot more complicated than this. Countries with large populations are not normally associated with high levels of wealth. Some other populous countries include India, Brazil, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nigeria, and Indonesia. If you look at a list of the wealthiest countries per capita, almost all of them are tiny little countries like Qatar or Switzerland. And there is a very good reason for this. Large populations eat up a country's resources, and this is especially true at lower levels of economic development. This actually becomes literally true when we go back to before the Industrial Revolution. Back in the agrarian era, China was not really a wealthy country in any way we would understand today. It may have had its wealthy, aristocratic elite, but its output, what its society produced, was almost entirely consumed by its large population. And I mean, again, literally consumed. Agriculture was the most important technology in the world until the Industrial Revolution. Everyone was involved in it. The primary sector was over 90% of the economy, and it employed over 90% of the population. Food was the priority of everyone from the top down. So societies produced food as their main economic output, and then their population ate it. An economy's output was almost entirely based on food production. This was before major productivity improvements coming from technology. So the quality and quantity of food production depended on the quality and quantity of farmland. It was all very region specific. Population and food production did not always go pleasantly hand in hand. If your population outstripped what your agricultural base could produce, that was bad news. This becomes a classic Malthusian trap. Good years can quickly turn into bad years as population growth rates increase faster than food production. These simple facts about the agrarian era may seem really obvious, but they are frequently forgotten, and this skews the basic way we look at the wealth and power of ancient states. For example, publications like the Financial Times or The Economist often put out charts that go back hundreds of years, tracing different countries' GDP over time. They almost all show China and India as around 30 to 35% of total global output. But this is a crazy way to talk or think about the ancient world. China's economy back then was directly proportional to its population. More people working on the farms meant more food production. That's about it. China and India just had a lot of peasants. Life for these farmers was so bad, it's hard for the average American to even imagine it. People spent all day and night growing food, eating food, preserving food, and trying to avoid famine. In general, measuring anything before the last couple hundred years with an output measure like GDP is just unhelpful. It skews the basic picture of what we're looking at. To say China was powerful with tens of millions of brutally poor peasants operating an unreliable and inefficient primary sector is really off base. Even what mattered back then was not necessarily the quantity of food production. It was the reliability and efficiency of food production. So in the past, large populations created a very difficult to manage embedded growth obligation. More people meant more food. More food meant more people or more land. Many empires rose and fell based on their ability to produce what they needed. Food production cycles are some of the most underrated cycles in history. And this is still what matters today. This isn't just some random rant. Life in the modern world is not as different as you might think. Even when we enter the industrial era, huge populations remain a problem. They are actually an even larger burden. It now goes way beyond just feeding people. People have to be clothed, educated, employed, and kept healthy. This all costs insane amounts of money. Once specialization kicks in, people can't just pick up the skills. They have to be trained. Enormous nations trying to move from an agricultural to an industrial or a service economy are starting from the bottom with no systems. They do not have the network of schools, universities, teachers, hospitals, medical research, drug and vaccine production systems. They have almost nothing. The larger the population is, the more difficult it is to build these systems in the first place. This is one of the main reasons why countries with large populations tend to exhibit such low levels of human capital development. It's just harder to upskill the population. Every year the country spends without these systems means more people will enter the workforce with limited education, few skills, and little income. Also, this often means very basic skills. For example, over 25% of Bangladeshi citizens are illiterate. Employment naturally becomes a major challenge for these countries. A country like China spends a lot of its time trying to guarantee people work. Because what happens when there's no work? Are people just supposed to stay on the farms? Or maybe they'll head to the cities and start protesting in the streets. It's not just a major challenge, it's a major threat. Large populations tend to mean really large, poor populations within the country. These poor populations create large economic burdens and costs. Nowhere is this more clear than in China. China's population in poverty is about equal to the total US population. This is insane and not mentioned when people think about China. People imagine the hundreds of thousands of educated workers or even millions, but they forget the hundreds of millions who don't have that education and don't have those skills and are barely making it through the year. A big reason US citizens are so prone to thinking places like Russia, India, Brazil, or China will be important competitors is because they assume these countries will develop their population, their human capital, just like the US did. But this assumption is a big mistake. The US is the outlier, not the norm. From the beginning, population size has not been everything. It's often been a huge problem. What countries do need is at least a respectable population size, just to play on the world stage. But after that, it is about matching the population to the territory, not just being as large as possible. Now let's talk about territorial size. Does a physically large country always mean a powerful country? The US and China are about the same size. So should they be of equal strength, however strength is calculated? Well, this may be a fun way for kids to compare countries. It is very unhelpful. The biggest reason is because all land is not created equal. So the question to ask isn't how big a country is overall, but how much good land does it have, and how much good land relative to bad land. And then, do the pieces fit together? How do the pieces fit together? Historically, good land has meant arable land, typically flat plains that can be farmed. The best land is flat, temperate, well watered plains alongside navigable rivers. Add in some insulation from foreign militaries, and this is the holy grail of economic geography. Most of what we consider land today is barely land under this definition, and old societies and old cultures didn't think most of the world was worth populating. Early humans were not dumb when they decided to limit settlement to a very small percentage of the Earth's surface. The reason this land is the best land is because of agriculture. This is the best type of land for humanity's most important technology. It is called the primary sector for a reason. It does come first. And amazingly enough, many of the natural features that are ideal for agricultural production are also extremely advantageous at higher levels of development. Big is only good if the pieces fit together to help create an integrated whole. And this just isn't the case for almost all large countries. For example, Canada is large, but it's barely connected to itself. Canada's population centers are scattered across thousands of miles in very different and difficult terrain. It's a kind of remote and weak nation for a reason. Meanwhile, Russia is large, but it's also intensely vulnerable. It doesn't have any military insulation, and it is at times powerful, but always on the defensive. Large invasions of Russia have been rituals for the last few centuries. Most of the time, big means unmanageable. Think about Indonesia. It's filled with thousands of islands. Or India, with its dozens and dozens of small little states, all somehow contained within one nation. Or Brazil, which is a few cities interspersed between jungles, forests, and mountains. A large territory often means a broken nation. The nation-state formation process is a violent and bloody one, but its purpose is to try and match peoples to a stable geography. However, most of the world never went through this. One reason is because the Europeans did, and then they went around and conquered almost everyone else, later on dividing up the world into many incoherent pieces. Still, ancient civilizations like China didn't coalesce into a nation-state generations ago for very good reasons. In China, big certainly meant unmanageable, volatile, and prone to territorial decomposition. In Chinese history, an empire at its territorial height was getting ready for a brutal fall. China does not have an ideal development geography. 2/3 of the country is hilly or mountainous, and China's porous borders make it a ritual target for invasion. China has half as much agricultural land as the United States, and on average, its highly subsidized farms are only 70% as productive as US farms. Land degradation is also further eroding the good land in China, and the productivity numbers on its farms are only reached by taking the agricultural equivalent of steroids. China juices its land because it is trying to support 4.5 times the US population on a much weaker physical foundation, and has been increasingly overpopulated for the last 500 years. Bad land is not something a country can escape, and especially not a large country in either territory or population. China's bad land keeps hundreds of millions of people chained to an inefficient countryside and creates a hard cap on the development of its labor force. If government or industry pull too many people off of the land too fast, famine will be the inevitable result. In the modern world, people see China's enormous government and think that's got to be a powerful country. Actually, the logic works the other way. China has a strong national government because it is overpopulated and saddled with lots and lots of bad land. Under these circumstances, the government has to be competent, or China breaks down into multiple warring states. The same principle applies for its military. China has an enormous military because it has historic enemies on all sides, but it actually spends more on domestic security than external defense because the territorial units of China just don't fit together well and never have. Population structure and territory are really the start of the discussion and not the end. From there, you've got to look at the interactions between population and territory over time. This is what the layers and layers of human history are composed of. It's about the population structure, labor force, land use patterns, distributions of landforms, and how one or more human groups related to these over time. Out of this emerges the economic, social, cultural, and political character of a place and people, or peoples. Just because a country had a big moment in history doesn't mean its future is bright. Often, a country that explodes onto the scene for a little bit had some combination of labor, land, capital, or technologies that matched the needs of the time. Portugal is an example, so is Imperial Spain, and arguably China today. Countries like these don't win all the time or at every point in history. And many of the big names in history, like Egypt, Persia, or India, don't immediately or necessarily have what it takes to succeed in the modern world. China's development in particular has been extraordinarily unusual. It's a result of a confluence of factors coming together in the late 20th and early 21st century. When China tried to modernize on its own from 1949 to 1979, it got nowhere. It faced the same challenge India did and does today. There simply isn't enough capital generation to meet the needs of its massive population. So external capital was needed, and this has been China's story, believe it or not, as far back as the Han Dynasty. Even a long history of having a large population and a large territory just doesn't mean all that much. One separate but related question to all this is about culture and society. How can we tell which groups or nations will have the largest influence in the world? Some countries cast an enormous shadow. Their fashions, art, science, and stylistic choices influence almost everyone. In the 18th century, this was France. Today, the US casts an overwhelming shadow on global culture. Our globalized world allowed for more cultural diffusion than ever before. But still, not all that many cultures actually diffuse. Oddly enough, US perceptions or even caricatures of other nations are often a major way they get noticed. Hollywood movies are a great example. For the US, all the reasons that gave it a large, integrated, and wealthy population also make it a culturally dynamic one. Culturally dynamic places like the US have a very important quality. They are resilient. Nations with a good population and territorial fit can undergo cultural shifts and survive them. This allows for the cultural dynamism that drives global trends. For many other countries, a cultural shift means immediate chaos or revolution. So some countries are just more internally resilient than others, and getting down into it is complicated, but you see it everywhere. For example, France has long had the strongest national culture in Europe and was a major force in global culture. And the US has undergone more shifts in the past 100 years than China did in over 1,000. Actually, it's even more stark than that. To make its shifts, China needed foreign role models, a benign security environment, as well as a totalitarian state to wrench itself through its recent transformative decades without unbearable upheaval. Autonomous changes are very different. Historically, China was a very influential nation in East Asia because it was the first state to develop core administrative, religious, political, and cultural structures used in the region. Back then, China was the first and largest region for mass agriculture in East Asia. Efficiency and reliability issues don't matter when you're the only game in town. Other nations adopted these norms to speed along their own development. In the modern world, things are very different. China's most important modern shifts are all part of a very difficult and rough process where the government is trying to manage a combination of intense population and territorial challenges. What's going on in China right now isn't producing the sort of culture that comes to dominate a global entertainment spectacle. If anything, it's more of a fight for survival. We are all far too used to measuring countries on a few quick metrics. To look at things properly, we've really got to start with the basics and then get them right. One easy way we avoid doing this is by lumping countries together as developing or developed countries, when many developing countries aren't really developing, and when many developed countries are continuing to develop. This is the sort of stuff that makes us vulnerable to nonsense like Goldman Sachs BRICS Group, which stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. There has probably never been a more unrelated group of countries. It's not just normal people who've been misled. Even these countries got sucked in. There is an international BRICS group. It has conferences and meetings, and public officials attend this bizarre hodgepodge with no unifying threads to connect it, aside from size, which by now looks like more of a liability than an asset. Overall, China has benefited more than any other country from quick judgments that make it seem large, powerful, ancient, and wise. Add in a very unique historical moment, and it all combines to accent the glorious, unified, and even radiant moments in Chinese history. But that, of course, is not the full story. Taking stock of China's potential doesn't mean drawing straight lines. It means understanding cycles. And China's cycles are about developing and then dissolving, rising and falling, building enormous monuments only to watch as they inevitably melt in the sun.